So hello everyone, welcome to this 7,000 subscriber special. I just want to say thank you again to everybody who has subscribed to our story over the last 3 years now. Amazing, the channel is 3 years old, and for all your really useful and thoughtful comments on Rail Story videos, as many of them are really informed, and it feels like over the last 3 years we've built up a little community of like-minded early railways and Victorian railway enthusiasts, and it feels a bit like an extended family, and I feel like I've grown to know many of you through our interactions online. So here we go, eyes down, looking for our 7,000 subscriber special question and answer. BP and SD asks about how reliable do I think the timings of Charles Root Martin were, and that he has serious doubts about them. Well, I agree with you. I have doubts about Root Martin's timing, and one of his more famous timings of a certain Great Western Railway engine, which may or may not have hit 100 miles an hour, has been called into question about 10 years ago when there was an academic paper which looked at whether said locomotive, named after a cathedral city in the West Country, could have achieved its exploit. And they looked at the steam demand of the cylinders and the steaming rate of the boiler and concluded there was not a cat in hell's chance it could have done it, because to run at that speed the boiler could not have provided sufficient steam for the cylinders, so it just couldn't have done it. It's sad, but there we are. Let the science trump the myths every time. Adam Bridgewater, thank you for your congratulations. Where did your interest in the hobby start? And what interests you so much in early and pioneering railways? As I said to Corb Smith of Railway Mania, my interest in railways, and particularly early railways, is entirely thanks to my mum. My mum and father, I believe, owned or had shares in a 8F locomotive, which lived for many years in a coal yard in Wakefield. I had no idea which one it was. But my mum, when she was training to be a teacher, did a whole curriculum, a whole term on early railways, and that really got me interested in it. And it was also at the same time that it was GWR 150 back in 1988, that's showing my age, and going to see the replica of Iron Duke and the replica of Rocket at the NRM. I also have to say I find anything after about 1860, 70, 80 just really boring. It's all very samey, and something like Mallard or Flying Scotsman bores me to tears. Same with Great Western stuff. Oh look, it's a green 10-wheeler. Wow. No interest whatsoever. I don't know that the Great Western Brigade, supporters of the green, wet and rusty, will take me out and lynch me whilst making sacrifices to the great god Brunel. But I just have no interest in it, I'm afraid. It just bores me to tears. Sam Rahan, thank you for your thanks for 7k subscribers. One question. Given the major impact of the 1923 grouping on Britain's railways, what would the railway network have looked like had it not happened? Quick slug of coffee. Well, the network would have looked very different. For a start, the East Coast main line would have been electrified as far as Newcastle. Before World War I, the North Eastern Railways proposing electrifying York to Newcastle using 1500 volt overhead DC, and electrifying from Newcastle to Carlisle using third rail electrification. Unfortunately, the Great War got in the way, and Vincent Raven started rolling out the project again immediately after World War I, but grouping happened so quickly that the whole thing was shelved. Similarly, the Great Northern Railway in 1919 proposed electrifying from King's Cross as far as York with a branch off to Leeds. The general manager, Oliver Bury, of the Great Northern, said in 1920 that they were going to electrify as far as York, and that their chief mechanical engineer, Mr. Gresley, was introducing quote-unquote monster locomotives as a stopgap until electrification came along. The problem was the London North Eastern Railway had no money. It was skint. It was perennially broke which meant there was no money to invest in electrification, and furthermore, most of the directors and shareholders were heavily invested in coal, so they would not have supported the transition over to an electric railway. Similarly, O'Brien on the Lancashire and Yorkshire wanted to extend Transpennine electrification with electrification between Manchester and Leeds, but the LMS said no. The London and North Western Railway had wanted to electrify between Crewe and Carlisle, but the engineer was summoned to Euston and summarily dismissed. The same thing had happened to Richard Dealey before World War I, when he had proposed electrifying Manchester to Derby. Again, with the Midland Railway, all of its money came from, not from passengers, but like the LNER, through the transportation of coal to London and its shareholders in major investments in coal mining. Similarly, the Great Western, which sat on millions of tons of Welsh steam coal, took no interest whatsoever in modernisation because it sat on coal. So, if grouping had not occurred, or occurred in the way it had done, East Coast Main Line would have been electric from about 1925, instead of being from the 1990s, which would have mean things like the Gresley A1s, A2s, the A3s, A4s would never have been built because of a nice shiny fleet of electric locomotives. Similarly, on the West Coast Main Line, if Crewe to Carlisle had been electrified, no doubt from Euston to Crewe as well. So again, you wouldn't have had Stanya's specifics. Oh dear, what a shame. We would have had a modern electric network. Second half of your question, early attempts of grouping or nationalisation. Well, the first attempt at railway grouping happened in France in the 1850s. Napoleon III looked at the French railway network and saw it was being managed quite inefficiently by about 130 separate companies. So in 1858 he passed a law which created the 6 big companies: Chemin de Fer du Nord, Chemin de Fer de Est, Ouest, PO, PLM, Midi. 6 big companies which had an absolute monopoly in the geographic area they covered. So things like Chemin de Fer du Nord covered everything from Paris north to the Channel port, Chemin de Fer d'Est, Paris to the Belgian and German frontier, PLM, the Paris-Lyon et à la Méditerranée, all the way down the east coast, east side of France, from Paris by Lyon to Marseille, west of France, PO, Paris-Orléans, Midi, south of France. So they had an absolute monopoly on that. But the problem was that this made the companies financially fragile because it made them reliant on the major industries within each grouping. So whilst railways in the east of France, particularly the Nord, PLM and the Est, were wealthy and had significant amounts of traffic, and they could grow their traffic thanks to being where the major industrial cities of France were, the Midi and the Ouest had to be, and particularly the Ouest, rescued by the French state because it was largely rural in West France. There wasn't the population, there wasn't the industry base to support it. In Britain, there had been moves to make bigger companies. In 1852, off the top of my head, there was a move to amalgamate the London North Western, the Midland and the North Staffordshire, and this was thrown out 3 times by the British Parliament, who didn't trust the railways, and this was a continual story all the way through British railway history, really until the end of BR in the 1990s, that Parliament didn't trust the railways for fear of them having a monopoly. This is particularly evident in the Victorian period and the interwar period, where the railways were shackled with all sorts of common carrier legislation, which meant they couldn't evolve, they couldn't develop, they couldn't rid themselves of unremunerative trade, and led to the roads taking over. So 1850 was an attempt to amalgamate the London North Western, Midland North Staffordshire. The 1870s, the London North Western tried to take over the Lancashire and Yorkshire, which would have given them a monopoly of something like 8% of all the network in the UK. Parliament said, no, you can't have a monopoly. There were various schemes to amalgamate the poor old mud, sludge and lightning, the Manchester, Sheffield and Lincolnshire Railway. with anybody else who had money, but they often fell through because the MS&L had basically no money to do anything, even under Watkin, until Watkin thought, right, we'll build an extension to London. And in the Edwardian period, there was a big scheme to amalgamate the Great Northern, the Great Central, and the Great Eastern into one major company. But again, Parliament stepped in and said, no, you would have a monopoly. We don't think a monopoly is fair, despite the cost savings that it would have presented to passengers, to businesses, and the rationalisation of the railway network that these big companies would have created. So that it reduced route mileage, reduced competition, everything would have worked more effectively and more efficiently, and things would have been cheaper. But never happened because Parliament said, no, you can't have big companies because we don't trust you, we don't like having monopolies. And the same was true when railways wanted to expand their interests into road carrying, with road services and running road motor buses. Parliament said, no, you can't have a monopoly here, you must divest yourself of your road interests. All of it sad, really. So, for Parliament getting in the way for further monopolies, having an integrated transport network, something we only really got in 1948 until the early 1950s, when the Tory government decided to get rid of British road transport. Again, part of nationalised network. I said, no, you can't. It's too much monopoly. JMO Arts. Why were early smokebox doors so tiny? Did it make it difficult to clean the tubes? The earliest smokebox doors weren't so much doors as in huge iron plates you had to be unbolted to unplan it. The smoke box is an iron disc with two handles held on with 12 bolts. You have to literally bolt this thing to gain access. It's a 2 or 3, maybe 4-person job really to do it, which meant actually cleaning the tubes and checking inside the smoke box. It's really inconvenient. First smoke box doors came along with patent in 1833, and they had usual doors like in a cupboard, like you see in the front of the line, which gives you access. Later you've got top-mounted ones from Ramsbottom and LWR with the hinge up, which give you reasonable access to the tubes. But you need to remember with boilers like this, the tubes don't go all the way to the top of the boiler. There's a steam space. So the top of the smoke box door, particularly the horizontal mounted ones that flip up like a cat flap, the top of that door is usually over the top row of tubes, so you can actually get your rods in to clean out. Julien Dugard, is that correct? Pronounce that correctly, Julien Dugard? About wooden wheels. Well, wooden wheels were used because cast iron wheels were so fragile. Wooden wheels had an advantage of being elastic. They usually had an oak hub and ash and elm spokes and fellies, which means the ash is strong and the compression of the elm is quite springy. So the wheel had a certain degree of elasticity and a certain degree of suspension, which would have been useful when you have railway locomotives which either didn't have springs or had very rudimentary springs and really poorly laid track. And again, particularly with wooden wheels where the wheels weren't coned, these would have been banging and bumping along every rail joint, which damaged the wheels, the locomotive and the track. So wooden wheels worked as a crude form of suspension, but they also worked because, unlike cast iron wheels, they wouldn't shatter hitting a bad joint or shattering very cold weather. The problem with wooden wheels is they're still quite fragile, particularly for running at high speed. So we know that whilst the wooden wheels of things like Rocket, Northumbrian and that generation of locomotives were fine, the early wooden wheels on Planet, which were so much more powerful and so much faster, they couldn't sustain high speed running. They often fell apart, which is why you started to get early wrought iron wheels, which were much stronger and much more durable. And you need to remember with wrought iron, the early name for wrought iron is malleable iron. So like a wooden wheel, unlike a cast iron wheel, there's a limited amount of elasticity to it. So there's a little bit of give in it. So it would be less prone to fracture. Backroom editor, hello Ben. What's the best moustache you've sported and why? Well, when I was in Paris a few years ago, after attending a reenactment event, and I was wearing a full imperial, so it looked like Napoleon III. This was waxed out. This wasn't a full set. This was the long, straggly goatee. I had a little bit more hair then, and my hair was worn longer. And it was, having come from a reenactment, it was my hair. I had my hair did like Napoleon III. And walking through Les Invalides, the Musée de la Mer in Paris, where there are the two huge coronation portraits of Napoleon III and the Impératrice Eugénie on display. And just walking through the gallery, unbeknownst to me, walking past one of these, the coronation portraits, and a group of visitors taking a double take as what they perceived to be Napoleon III had just walked out of a painting. Should others have more moustaches, particularly on railways? Well, there lies a tale, because most Victorian railwaymen were not permitted to wear beards or moustaches. It was against company rules and regulations to have facial hair. The London North Western Railway maintained a ban on beards and moustaches until the 1870s. The London and South Western Railway maintained its ban until the 1880s, and other lines like the North Staffordshire Railway, which basically copied everything the London North Western did, they also had a ban on beards and moustaches, which was quite ironic given that their manager at the time, a chap called Forsyth, had really quite pronounced sideburns. So me depicting a Victorian railway worker is completely unhistorical to have facial hair of any sort. Edwardian railway workers, when railway workers were permitted to wear moustaches, again very fashionable to wear a clipped moustache, but then they fell out of fashion again in the 1920s. So railway moustaches were not a thing until about 1890, 1900. Yet we traditionally think of Victorian railwaymen as being a particularly hairy lot with beards you can stuff into your belt and sideburns out here, looking a bit like the famous Phil Harding from Time Team. Lovely chap, by the way, absolutely cracking chap. That's not how they looked, because they didn't have beards and moustaches. Tweetsy Railroaders. Covering American locomotives, yes. Problem is access to data and access to photographs of them. YouTube is a visual medium, and without video of these locomotives or images, I can't really produce a video. Makoman Saki-Saks. Can you do a video on pre-first with war compartment carriages? Yes, but I'm not sure how much interest there would be. Does a train of such carriages exist in the UK? Yes, several trains of such carriages exist on the Bluebell Railway, the Isle of Wight Steam Railway, and on the Foxfield Railway, where they run with Victorian four-wheel compartment coaches. All three are well worth the visit. Imagination Station, why early locomotives? I think I answered that earlier. It's more interesting. To understand railway history, you need to know, well, in fact, all history, you need to understand where you've come from, to understand what's happening at the end. Flying Scot, we all know the Great Central's most famous lines, London Extension and the Woodhead line with duplicates, the Midland Main Line, and the North Staffs line through the Pennines. What else did the North Staffs do that others did, but to say louder? Copy with more success of fame, so to speak. Well, the North Staffs really didn't. The North Staffs was a very compact little tiddler of a thing, with quite a close geographical area that it served. It did run trains as far as Derby, Nottingham and Llandudno and Reading, North Wales, but they were for wakes and holiday trains, so it's not really fair to compare the Great Central and the Midland with the North Staffs, because they're two very different networks, two very different things. Azriel La Santa. Mr. Dawson, what is your favourite Welsh railway locomotive? Well, it's either Russell, which in fact is a Yorkshire engine, was built in Hunslet, or anything produced by Neath Abbey. They are absolutely crackers. Often plateway locomotives, and show parallel evolution from the 1820s, 1830s, how the locomotive evolved for plate rails, that's rails that look like that with an L-shaped rail, as opposed to the Stephenson type on edge rail, and really what you could describe as being similar to the northeastern locomotives developed by the likes of Timothy Hackworth, with the return flue boilers and the inclined or vertical cylinders. Is its parallel evolution to fit and they fit their own evolutionary niche. So while Hackworth machines fit the evolutionary niche in the northeast, the Neath Abbey locomotives fit the evolutionary niche of South Wales, where you have plateways rather than edge rails. Surlive, bit of an out there question. I've been trying to work out how to introduce early steam technology into Dungeons and Dragons. More than just a surface level contrivance for fast travel or storytelling set piece. I really want to capture the advent of early railways deeply, the fundamental changes of society, even one of sword and sorcery. Oh boy, I think the best way it's being done, but the evolution of railways is perhaps a bit quick, is by the late Sir Terry Pratchett in his Discworld novel Making Steam, where he really sums up the, if not the 1830s experience, but the 1840s railway mania experience. His technology is too quick, really, from the first locomotive to passenger trains going across the disc. But you see the changes in society, particularly in the sword and sorcery, sword and sandals universe. And in something like the Dungeons and Dragons universe, where you have wizards with either 1 or 2 Zs, with teleportation spells, it would open up fast and long distance travel to the masses, rather than to find your local friendly wizard in his tower to say, "Here, mate, I'll give you 22 gold and 800 silver for a quick teleportation spell," and hope that the wizard does not turn out to be a mimic. One can only imagine what Lord of the Rings would have been like if Frodo et al. Had got the 8:45 express from Hobbiton to Mordor, calling out Mount Doom and all stations in between. There'd have been considerably less trudging. Dank London, and this is one of several questions about Shannon. When first built, it probably wouldn't have had a cab, and in terms of livery, it would have been royal blue. George England painted his locomotives royal blue, and I really mean royal blue, with white enamel builder's plates with black text on them. They would have been quite garish. McZacoman1509, bit of an odd question. Did anyone ever try to steal the designs of George Stephenson or other pioneers to try and compete them? Yes. Not so much designs of George Stephenson, but the designs of Robert Stephenson, particularly his Planet and his Samson design. George and Robert were very keen to patent all their innovations. George took out his first patent in 1815 for a railway locomotive. Unfortunately, one design that Robert didn't patent was the Planet. But he believed that in a world of gentlemen's agreements and so forth, that he had designed, no one would try to steal it. However, these gentlemen's agreements and all being nice to each other didn't really cut much water internationally. So the basis of the Baldwin Locomotives Works in America is an act of theft, intellectual theft, by Matthias Baldwin, who copied a Stephenson Planet with the old Ironside, copied it lock, stock and barrel. Baldwin didn't understand the design, to be honest, which is why Old Ironside was not a conspicuous success, but that was the basis of his locomotive empire. Similarly with the Norris brothers, wholesale borrowing designs from Edward Berry of Liverpool. The situation was different in France, where due to high export tariffs from Britain and high import tariffs in France, a bit like the current rather sad political situation between Britain and its nearest neighbours, building barriers instead of looking for free trade and opening up opportunities to travel and education. Export barriers meant that in France, to import a British locomotive, you had to sign an awful lot of paperwork and to get permission to export it from Britain and permission to import into France. The way to do that without massive import tariffs was to import a design as a technical tool or a training object to be studied and dismantled, which is how Maxima imported two Stephenson locomotives on the proviso that they were dismantled and studied, and he wouldn't take out a patent on the design. And that's how the first Planet locomotives were imported into France as an educational tool. They were copied on the proviso so long as the French engineers in question didn't take out a patent for it in France. So that's how the Planet design got to America, how it got to France. In America, through downright intellectual theft, in France, through state-sponsored, you might call, industrial sabotage. But again, the Locks and Canals Company in the United States actually wrote to Robert Stephenson saying, we're building your designs, we think they're fantastic, can you offer any pointers? Quite what Robert would have made of that correspondence with the Locks and Canals Company, which built by far the largest number of Planet locomotives ever, would have made that, I've no idea. But Stephenson was pretty sure thereafter to patent everything he did, and he had an enforcer for his patent rights in Europe, a chap called Edward Folger Starbuck, and a very astute legal team. So if anybody dared build a Stephenson locomotive in breach of his patent, Starbuck would go in with a mob of heavies and tell them to cease and desist. Soviet spy Bob, why do you think so many early locomotives had crank axles and inside cylinders, when they must have been such a technical feat compared to straight axle and outside cylinders? Yes, they were a technical feat, but as Robert Stephenson put it, inside cylinders put the reciprocating mass closer to the centre line of the locomotive. Experiences with outside cylinder locomotives like Rocket and Northumbrian, and this was a period before anybody had thought of introducing balance weights on the wheels to balance the effect of the reciprocating mass of not just the piston in the cylinder but the connecting rods and the valve gear, meant that locomotives were very damaging to themselves in the track, a phenomenon known as hunting or boxing, where the locomotive would shift from side to side with each thrust of the cylinder. Not the cylinder, the piston. So by placing the cylinders close to the centre line, you obviate that hunting effect. Having them inside under the smoke box is more efficient because the cylinders are kept warm. And on some designs there's a steam jacket around the cylinder to keep it warm, so you're not suffering from condensation in the cylinder. And remember, in this period the drain cock had yet to be invented, so the last thing you want is condensation or carryover in your cylinder, as that will blow the end caps off. You have drain taps like those on Lion, but they can only be operated from ground level, not from the cab. So the inside cylinder prevents condensation, prevents water forming in the cylinder, and it keeps the centre of mass and the reciprocating mass close to the centre line. It also makes the locomotives narrower, which gives them a much wider route availability. And in this period, the kinetic envelope of early railways, which you might also term the loading gauges, kinetic envelope was quite small. particularly with reference to civil engineering like tunnels and so forth. So it keeps locomotives small. And again, in particular, there was no standard loading gauge across the country, which meant that companies like Robert Stephenson, who's churning out mass-produced locomotives, you've got an odds on bet your locomotive is going to fit the railway of your customer. Super Yoshi, gosh, crikey, here's a lot. What's your favourite Great Eastern Steam locomotive? That's the Decapod. Favourite 060 goods locomotive. LNW RDX class. What was the first diesel shunter ever made? If we're talking about diesel, as in diesel fuel, and purpose-built diesel shunter, that was a locomotive which is very dear to my heart, called Rom River. And she was built by Kerr Stewart and Company of Manchester in 1929 for the Ravenglass and Eskdale Railway up in Cumbria. And she's the first purpose-built diesel shunter for the standard gauge. The first diesel engine shunter, as it then turned heavy oil engine, was built by Hornsby Ackroyd in 1896 for the Royal Arsenal Railway, Woolwich Arsenal in London. That was 1896. And that was to create a fireproof locomotive working in an explosive factory, where a steam locomotive not necessarily welcome. How was it to operate rocket? Air-cooled, very much open-topped. It's lovely in summer. If it's cold, wet and windy, it's absolutely horrible. And there's not much to hang on to. There's no footplate railings. There's no grab handles other than the water pipes for the water pumps, which is where Planet, having its fences around the footplate is very welcome. There's a sense of security you get with Planet you don't get with Rocket. What are your 5 favourite steam locomotives? In no particular order. Planet, but I might be biased. The Bio Peacock Glyn Valley tram engines, they look like little steam tanks. Lion, obviously, again, I might be biased with Lion. I have a strong fondness for the NA class Baldwin Volclane compounds built for the Puffing Billy Railway in Australia. And I also have a soft spot for Ravens Pacifics built for the Northeastern, because I do like an underdog. How many of Planet's class were built in the UK? There was about 40. Globally, over 100, the majority of them being pirate planets built in the United States. Scrolly, Freebird. What do we know about Rocket's life after she left the Liverpool and Manchester Railway? In 1836, she was sold to Kirkhouse Colliery, where she worked coal trains, and she was modified with additional buffer beams and buffers and draw gear to work coal trains, and she worked at Kirkhouse until about 1840. Whilst working at Kirkhouse, she was involved in her 3rd fatal accident, where a young colliery lad ran out across the line in front of her, and he was knocked down and killed. Thereafter, there was a period of storage when she was dismantled. Robert Stephenson wanted to put Rocket and locomotion on display at the Great Exhibition at the Crystal Palace. However, there were legal problems with doing this because of the ownership of both engines, particularly Rocket. and Rocket was taken to Newcastle for restoration, and was dismantled and lay in pieces at Stephenson's yard until the legal issues and the ownership of the locomotive was sorted in the 1860s, when it was restored by Stephenson's and then went on display in the 1860s at the South Kensington Museum, which became the Science Museum. That modelling bloke, thanks for the congratulations, preserved locomotives that ended up being scrapped. I think the most famous are North Star and Lord of the Isles, when William Stanier said there's not enough space at Swindon, let them go. Will Powell ask about Wantage Tramway Shannon? I don't know. It would need a full Dr. Michael Bailey treatment. Simon Fink, again, thanks for your congratulations and glad to have you on board. Talks about the North British conglomerate of Sharp, Stewart, Dubs and Nielsen in order to compete with Baldwin's capacity. Other momentous decisions taken in locomotive building history influenced by the global economy. Yes, so what you have in Britain is the formation of the Locomotive Manufacturers Association in the 1870s, which was a trade association created to protect the interests of private locomotive builders, and that was headed up by Buyer Peacock. And that was formed at a time when the railway companies were trying to produce locomotives for other railway companies. Famously, the London North and Western had been building locomotives for the Lancashire and Yorkshire, which the private company said, we're not having this. This is unacceptable. So what you see in the 1880s, particularly in the 1890s, is a diversification of the products built by major locomotive manufacturers such as Buyer Peacock, because they recognise that in many ways steam was at its zenith in the 1890s, and they recognise there's competition not just from America but also from Germany with the likes of Krupp's and Orenstein and Koppel. They're suddenly able to produce locomotives again at a global market, challenging the British dominance. So what Buyer Peacock did was to diversify. So Buyer Peacock moved into building steam street tramway locomotives. They start building electric locomotives, and they produced electric locomotives for the London Underground system. They start producing road locomotives, so they produced patented steam lorries. This is all about 1890, 1900s, diversify their portfolio to keep the works in operation. And then famously, they start to build the go anywhere, do anything Buyer Garrett patent locomotive from 1908. And to be honest, if it hadn't been for the Buyer Garrett, Buyer Peacock would probably have closed long before the 1960s, as the Buyer Garrett effectively saved Buyer Peacock. Trains with Lewis asked, do you have a favourite narrow gauge locomotive? Well, I have two. First is the Buyer Peacock trams for the Glyn Valley, and the second is perhaps an odd choice, but it is the NA class Bucklane Baldwins for the Puffing Billy. I think they are amazing locomotives and they are drop dead gorgeous. Thomas Shafto, did the Prime Minister have a private coach in the early days of steam? No, they didn't. I don't think any Prime Minister ever did. Favourite express locomotive like Mallard or Flying Scotsman? Ravenair one. And in fact, the Ravenair 1 was a better locomotive than the Gresley production. It had a better boiler, higher steaming rate, higher tractive effort, lower exhaust temperatures, and on trial between King's Cross and Leeds, the Raven locomotive running against Flying Scotsman outperformed it. Not what Gresley wanted at all. Whoopsie! Which countries that used to have railways that no longer exist? Sierra Leone is the first one that comes to mind, and you should really check out the Sierra Leone Railway Museum. And I don't know where she's coming down the mountain has come from, I'm afraid, which is sad as I'm a musician, but I just don't know. Max Z, start of a flurry of questions about steam traction engines. I don't know, they're out of my wheelhouse, I'm afraid. For traction engines on railway, I don't know. Of early British 460s, probably the Highland Jobby, the Jones Goods. Ellen Yard J50. What is a J15? Is it the? I don't know what a J15 is. I'm sorry, it's too modern. Were Blue Circle 9449? Were traction engines Cramptons? Did they infringe the patent? Crampton's patent was for railway locomotives only, and by the time Blue Circle came along, the patent had expired. Stephen Kaiser. What is the best, most important engine in Australia? In terms of homebrew, I think it's that peculiar thing for is it Melbourne? Which is the first Australian steam-built locomotive. It's built on a pile drive or something. It's a peculiar looking thing. And if not that, I would say it's the Bayer Garrett, because I think more than anything for Australia, the Bayer Garrett really opened up Australia in the interwar years. And it showed the full potential of rail travel in Australia, with the amount of work it could perform, particularly on lightly laid track, and the loads it could pull. It's a massive revolution in Australia and other countries. I think particularly of Africa, we have lightly laid track, sometimes not the standard gauge, trains having to go immense distances and pull immense loads, and the Bayer Garrett was really the master of that. Gain plays. I'm from Venezuela. Hi there. There are some interesting locomotives there. I know there are. I would love it if you talk about Ferrocarril La Guerra y Caraza. Yeah, I'd recommend some. Is it Carazas or is it Carazas? Recommend some books and some images. I've not read anything about it. Kyle Pennypacker, ventilation shafts for tunnels. Yep, been used for a long time. How did the London Underground vent the exhaust from their locomotives? Well, it's a unusual fact that most of the London Underground isn't actually underground. The majority of the underground system is above ground, either literally above ground or running in cuttings. So there were ventilation shafts, but there weren't fans or anything like that, as the belief was that the running through the tunnel of the locomotive would act like a piston in a cylinder and push all the horrible, foul, stale air out with it. For underground working, the locomotives were coke-fired so as not to produce smoke, and they were condensers so that they didn't produce any steam. And the early underground locomotives like Fowler's Ghost was technically a fireless locomotive with a huge boiler as a receiver filled with heated fire bricks and a little tiddly coke fire at the back to keep the water boiling. The condensing gear, particularly the met tanks by a peacock, was great, but it meant that the feed water heating the tanks got too hot, often to boiling point. So before it was electrified, the London Underground was really quite horrible. We mentioned Mordor earlier, but think about Mount Doom, hot smoking stank of sulphur. And in fact, Victorian quackery thought that cures for all types of chest conditions like asthma, and speaking as an asthmatic, this is possibly the worst thing you could possibly do, was to treat asthma or bronchitis or blocked up sinuses, was to take people into the London Underground and to inhale all this smoky, sulphurous, foul air to clean the tubes out. All I can think of is resulting in mass asthma attacks. But that was the thought. And ventilation on the tube is still a problem. Edward Vincent Briones or Briones? Briones. I've been looking over the fleet list of the LNWR President class and found at least 3 locomotives named after United States presidents. Can you explain the naming of these particular locomotives? Well, the first one was the President Garfield in January 1882. And that was named in honour of President Garfield, who had been assassinated in the, was it September, November, or autumn of 1881. And the other 2 were named after the earliest presidents of the United States. The LNWR also named locomotives after other VIPs and global dignitaries. So it's part of a theme. And I think that is it, other than one question from Patreon about Henry Booth. Was Henry Booth and is Henry Booth overlooked in railway history? Yes. Henry Booth is overlooked for his contribution to locomotive development and railway management. Most enthusiasts today, and in fact most primary school kids, learn that Rocket was built by George Stephenson. It wasn't built by George Stephenson at all. It was built by Robert Stephenson at his works in Newcastle upon Tyne, with massive input from Henry Booth. The initial partnership for the premium engine, as it was termed, was between Stephenson and Booth, who both put up the money for it. But the partnership was changed to include Robert due to the amount of effort he was putting into the design. The boiler design is entirely that of Henry Booth. It's not Robert's design, it's not George's design. And now, after having visited the Conservatoire National des Arts et Métiers and having read about Marc and Paul Seguin, not Seguin, Sagan, sorry, Paul Marc Sagan, and their design of the chaudière tubulaire, the tubular boiler, one has questions about where Booth actually got the design for the multi-tubular boiler, particularly since the Segans had patented and published their boiler design in 1828. The design was freely available as a French patent, but French patents didn't extend across the Channel. See previous comments about British patents not being recognised outside of Britain. And the fact, there's an interesting letter from Paul Seguin, who attended the Rainhill trials, saw the boiler rocket, and wrote a furious letter home to Marc, saying, "They've nicked our boiler! Mon Dieu, c'était mon chaudière tubulaire! How can this be? They have stolen our design!" So there's questions about the originality of Henry Booth's design. But more importantly than that is Henry Booth's contribution to railway management. Henry Booth wore several hats on the Liverpool and Manchester. He was a secretary, treasurer and general manager. We might call him as a chief operating officer in today's parlance. And it doesn't matter how good your track is, your carriages are, your locomotives are, to manage a transport business like the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, if your management structure is faulty. It didn't matter how good Stephenson's engines were, or the track or anything, if it couldn't actually organise itself. So the Liverpool and Manchester Railway is not just the birth of the mainline railway as a concept, but it's the birth of the mainline railway and the modern railway as a management and organisational concept, and that is entirely down to Henry Booth. The Stockton and Darlington Railway had a horizontal management structure, and in terms of its management, it was pre-capitalist, and it wasn't a modern company. It wasn't a modern railway in terms of its organisation. It was a Quaker business. It was basically run as a family business, despite having its shares held publicly. So it's a joint stock business. But the Stockton and Darlington was managed by committees, and it didn't have a vertical hierarchy. It had a horizontal one, and it didn't have salaried managers. It had waged staff, and it lacked specialist staff within that structure. And that's largely the result of it being a Quaker business, and this horizontal egalitarian structure arising from the way Quakers do business. The vertical structure of the Liverpool and Manchester is meritocratic, and that owes its origins to Unitarian structures, because Henry Booth was Unitarian, and they believed in the best man for the job. So they believed if you had the skills, the education, and providing the skills and education to fit someone for their job. So the Liverpool and Manchester had a fully formed structure with a board of directors at the top, supported by a management subcommittee which dealt with the day-to-day business of the railway. Beneath the subcommittee were various specialist subcommittees which managed aspects such as the coal business, the passenger carrying business, the merchandising business, and there was an engineering committee as well. Each of these fed back into departments. Again, this was something early railways lacked. There were no departments with departmental managers. Again, this is entirely thanks to Henry Booth. So you had an engineering department headed up by the chief engineer. Engineering department included locomotives, civil engineering. You have a head of the passenger department. You have a head of the goods department. You have a head of the minerals department. And within that you have all the bureaucracy, office staff, assistant managers, deputies and so forth to actually run the railway. And that was all in place when the railway opened. If that hadn't been in place, it is unlikely that the Liverpool and Manchester Railway would not have been a success. It wouldn't have been able to function as a railway. So it's thanks to Henry Booth, not just through his boiler design, or we could call it the Booth-Sagan boiler with a hyphen. That wouldn't have mattered if the business side of the railway, not only managing the business, but the operational management side of the railway had been faulty. It wasn't faulty, and it worked. And the amazing thing is, all of this was in place, all this structure was in place by the opening day, including heads of departments to make this railway work. And it's from the Liverpool and Manchester Railway that every subsequent railway in Britain developed its managerial and operating model. It didn't look to the Stockton and Darlington because that was pre-capitalist, proto-modern. It's not a modern company. It's not a modern railway. They're looking to the vertical hierarchy with its departments, departmental heads, and salaried professionals to take charge of the company, because the Stockton and Darlington were risk averse. They wouldn't make risks, and where there was risk involved, they put it out to subcontractors and freelancers. There were very few wage or salary positions. Liverpool and Manchester comes along, you have salaried staff, you have wage staff, you have a full working business model, you have a hierarchical management structure which everybody else copies. It's boring looking at, and it's not as glamorous looking at locomotives, it's not as glamorous as carriages or track or bridges, but it's the business side of the railway that really, really matters. And it really crucially mattered in 1830. Because if they hadn't got the business right, if they hadn't got the business model right, if they hadn't got the management structure right, no, it doesn't matter how good Rocket was, the business wouldn't have worked. So it's thanks to Henry Booth that we actually have working railways and the structure that they have. It's probably going to sound a cliche, but I can't emphasise enough how important the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was. Not just from its technological point of view, not just from a business point of view, but from a management point of view. And I think it is testimony to Booth that they got it right from day one, simply because they had to. Henry Booth, more than George Stephenson, I think is the father of the railways, because he put in place the management structure to make them work. So I hope I've answered as many questions as possible. As you can tell, I am losing my voice. I have been talking for an hour solid, without repetition, hesitation or deviation. If you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. If you would like to like, share and subscribe, please do that. Please also consider supporting Rail Story on Patreon. And our 3 tiers on Patreon, which helps keep Rail Story ticking over. Your generosity has bought me a new monitor, new studio microphone, and even a new PC, without which Rail Story would be dead. And you can also support Rail Story and buy me a cup of coffee or Ko-fi. So once again, thank you very much to all of you out there as part of the Rail Story. Thank you, as part of the Rail Story family. Thank you for your support over 3 years. Let's keep Rail Story going. Let's keep Rail Story rolling to 8, 9, 10,000 subscribers. Let's see where we go. Thanks for being part of the Rail Story family and part of the Rail Story journey. See you all next time on Rail Story.